A Broken Vow: Putin's conscript gamble in Ukraine. Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, made a solemn promise at the outset of the Ukraine war. Conscripts would not be sent into combat. This assurance, delivered with Putin's characteristic air of authority, was intended to quell public anxiety and project an image of a limited military operation. The Russian public, already wary of the conflict, found some solace in these words, believing that their young sons would be spared the horrors of war. However, recent events have exposed the hollowness of Putin's words. The reality on the ground tells a different story, one of broken promises and escalating conflict. Conscripts, many fresh out of training and ill-prepared for the realities of war, are now being deployed to the front lines. These young men, who have barely had time to adjust to military life, are thrust into the chaos of combat with little preparation. The presence of conscripts in Ukraine is not a secret. It is an open secret that has been reluctantly acknowledged by the Kremlin, despite their initial denials. Independent media outlets, human rights groups, and families of the soldiers themselves have documented their deployment. These groups have been vocal in their criticism, highlighting the dangers and ethical concerns of sending unprepared young men into battle. Social media is awash with accounts of young men, barely old enough to shave, being shipped off to the front. These posts paint a grim picture of the situation, showing the fear and uncertainty faced by these conscripts. These are not the hardened professional soldiers that the Kremlin would have the world believe are fighting in Ukraine. Instead, they are inexperienced youths, many of whom have never seen combat before. They are, in many cases, teenagers with minimal training and outdated equipment. Their lack of experience and inadequate gear make them particularly vulnerable in the harsh realities of war. The deployment of conscripts represents a significant escalation of the conflict and a dangerous gamble on Putin's part. It is a move that risks not only the lives of these young men, but also the stability of the region. It is a tacit admission that the special military operation, as the Kremlin insists on calling it, is not going according to plan. The initial objectives have not been met, and the situation is becoming increasingly dire. The Russian military, it seems, is facing a shortage of manpower, and the Kremlin is resorting to desperate measures to replenish its ranks. This shortage has forced them to rely on conscripts, despite the risks and ethical concerns. This is a sign of weakness, not strength, and it has not gone unnoticed by Russia's adversaries. NATO and other Western powers are closely monitoring the situation, aware that the use of conscripts indicates deeper issues within the Russian military. The decision to send conscripts into battle is not just a strategic blunder, it is a moral outrage. It has sparked protests and outcry from families and human rights organizations who see it as a betrayal of trust. These young men are being used as cannon fodder in a war that many of them do not understand and do not support. Their distress and confusion are palpable, as they are caught in a conflict that seems far removed from their everyday lives. They are being asked to sacrifice their lives for a cause that is becoming increasingly unpopular at home. The war's unpopularity is growing, and the use of conscripts only adds to the discontent. This is a betrayal of the trust that these young men and their families placed in their government. The emotional toll on families is immense as they grapple with the fear and uncertainty of their loved one's fate. It is a stain on the conscience of Russia, and it will have far-reaching consequences for the country's future. The decision to use conscripts in this manner will have a lasting impact on the nation's psyche and its standing in the world. Ill-prepared and outmatched, conscripts on the front lines. The conscripts being sent to Ukraine are woefully unprepared for the harsh and brutal realities of combat. Many of them received only a few weeks of basic training before being deemed ready for deployment, a period far too short to adequately prepare them for the complexities and dangers of modern warfare. This training, according to accounts from conscripts and their families, is often perfunctory and inadequate, focusing more on rote drills than on practical combat skills. The emphasis is on repetition, rather than on developing the critical thinking and tactical skills necessary for survival on the battlefield. The equipment provided to these conscripts is often outdated and insufficient, leaving them at a severe disadvantage against a well-equipped enemy. There are widespread reports of conscripts being issued rusty rifles, insufficient ammunition, and inadequate medical supplies. This lack of proper equipment not only hampers their effectiveness in combat, but also puts their lives at greater risk. In some cases, conscripts have been forced to purchase their own gear, including essential items like boots and body armor, from their meager salaries. This additional financial burden adds to their already high levels of stress and anxiety. The lack of training and equipment is compounded by a lack of leadership and morale. Many conscripts feel abandoned and unsupported, leading to a pervasive sense of hopelessness and despair. Many conscripts are being led by inexperienced officers who are themselves struggling to adapt to the chaotic realities of the Ukrainian battlefield. These officers, often just as unprepared as the conscripts they command, are unable to provide the guidance and support needed in such a volatile environment. The result is a recipe for disaster, with poorly trained and ill-equipped conscripts being thrown into the teeth of a determined and well-armed enemy. The lack of preparation and support leads to high casualty rates and devastating losses. The accounts emerging from the front lines paint a grim picture. Conscripts are facing overwhelming odds and are often outmatched by the enemy's superior training and equipment. Conscripts are being killed and wounded in droves. The medical facilities are overwhelmed, and many do not receive the care they desperately need. Those who survive are often traumatized by the experience. The psychological toll of constant danger and the horrors of war leave deep and lasting scars. They return home, if they return at all, physically and psychologically scarred, haunted by what they have seen and done. The reintegration into civilian life is fraught with challenges, and many struggle to find peace and normalcy. These are not the battle-hardened veterans of Russia's past wars. They are young, inexperienced, and vulnerable, thrust into a conflict they are ill-prepared to face. They are the victims of a cynical and reckless gamble by a regime that is willing to sacrifice its own people on the altar of its imperial ambitions. The human cost of this conflict is staggering, and the true extent of the suffering may never be fully known. Voices of dissent. Families and critics speak out. In the heart of Russia, a growing chorus of voices is rising against the backdrop of a contentious war. The deployment of conscripts has not gone unnoticed or unchallenged within Russia. The sight of young men being sent off to fight has sparked a wave of outrage and sorrow. Families of conscripts, desperate for the safety of their loved ones, have taken to the streets and social media to voice their anger and despair. They are using every platform available to them to make their voices heard. Mothers, fathers, wives, and girlfriends are demanding answers from the government. They are united in their quest for truth and justice, seeking to understand the rationale behind the deployment. They want to know why their sons, husbands, and boyfriends are being sent to die in a war that many Russians believe is both unjust and unwinnable. The emotional toll on these families is immeasurable. The Kremlin has sought to silence these voices of dissent, labeling them as unpatriotic and subversive. The government's heavy-handed approach has only fueled the fire of resistance. Independent media outlets that dare to report on the plight of conscripts are harassed, censored, or shut down. The suppression of free press is a clear attempt to control the narrative. Journalists and activists who speak out against the war are arrested and imprisoned. Their bravery in the face of such adversity is a testament to their commitment to the truth. Despite the Kremlin's best efforts, the truth is getting out. Underground media and citizen journalists are finding ways to bypass censorship and share their stories with the world. The voices of dissent are growing louder. The protests are becoming more frequent and more intense as more people join the movement. Opposition leaders, human rights activists, and even some pro-war commentators have publicly criticized the decision to send conscripts into battle. Their voices add weight to the growing opposition. They argue that it is both morally wrong and strategically unsound. The ethical implications of sending young men to fight in a controversial war are being questioned. They warn that it will only prolong the conflict and deepen the divisions within Russian society. The long-term consequences of this war are becoming increasingly apparent. The Kremlin's attempts to stifle dissent are counterproductive. The more they try to silence the opposition, the more determined the protesters become. The more the government tries to silence its critics, the louder those critics become. The resilience of the Russian people is on full display. The crackdown on dissent is a sign of weakness, not strength. It reveals the government's fear of losing control over its citizens. It is an indication that the Kremlin is losing control of the narrative. The government's grip on power is slipping as more people question its actions. The Russian people are not as easily fooled as Putin might think. They are becoming increasingly disillusioned with the government's propaganda. They are starting to see through the propaganda and lies. The truth is becoming harder to suppress as more people speak out. They are starting to ask questions. The public discourse is shifting as more citizens demand transparency and accountability. And the Kremlin does not have the answers. The government's inability to address the concerns of its people is becoming increasingly evident.